In New York میری یک دفعه مکه میری یک دفعه معظمه میری دیگه تو بوی جنیسی کلی چطوری
خداوند هم يقال دعایت قبول کنه فهمت؟
Yeah, I did that. Yeah, a lot. Yeah.
ما شاء الله هو بسيط المسجد. It's always in the masjid. How is it?
That's good, brother. You can speak. Well, the masjid, yeah, because I have nothing to do too, you know.
So you put the bar in the masjid. I rather be like
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's the best position. I don't know what I would be doing without it. Your brother's right. Oh, so okay. Brother, I'm doing
I was out of town.
He was out of the town for a week.
You've been there before.
Yeah, I love you.
My beloved. We always say each other.
I don't know how this is gonna work with like 50 people back there.
They make it a speaker louder, you know.
If they are being loud, I guess maybe.
Assalamu alaikum. Inshallah, we're going to start the program in about 30 seconds, so whoever plans to listen, please come to your seats. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I begin in the name of Almighty Allah. I invoke His peace and blessings upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to extend His blessings to the Prophet's family, his companions, and the men and women that walk in the footsteps, and I ask Allah to make us among them. Ameen. Brothers and sisters, Jazakumullah khairan. This is the Tafseerah program, and tonight, inshallah, is session number 25 with Surah Al-Baqarah. We started in January of 2023, and looks like we're gonna have to stop maybe tonight or next Friday. I was hoping that we'd finish Surah Al-Baqarah before Ramadan, but it's a lot of things, a lot of material to cover. So I don't think that we're going to be able to finish Surah Al-Baqarah before Ramadan, inshallah. So we'll probably resume. It might take us, maybe a couple of months in the summer, or maybe late spring, before we're able to finish this, inshallah. To refresh your memories, I've said this so many times, again, 24 times thus far. Surah Al-Baqarah is the surah that was revealed mainly in the Madani period. Throughout the Madani period, actually over the course of 9 years, most of it earlier. And it sets the tone for the mission and vision of the Islamic community, the mission and vision of this ummah, basically, as I said repeatedly. And that we have a role to play right here in this world. And that role is to do the work of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That role is to be His representatives on earth. Allah said to the angels, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. I will establish a trustee of mine on earth, in reference to Adam alayhi salam, and by consequence, each and every one of us. So Surah Al-Baqarah is the constitution of this ummah. It basically bears our marching orders, as I have said before. And the theme of Surah Al-Baqarah, as I've said multiple times, is how to cultivate the earth for the purposes of the Creator. How to cause this earth to thrive in accordance with the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the word that we used in Arabic is Imaratul Ard. Imaratul Ard, building the earth, literally. How to build the earth properly for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you guys remember, I said before that building the earth doesn't mean high rises and skyscrapers and highways and big fancy cities. It means something else. And inshallah, that concept is going to become a lot more apparent in our conversation tonight. Surah Al-Baqarah is divided into 4 sections. We finished section 2 last time. And section 2 basically was the prerequisites of Imaratul Ard. What are the things that must be present first before we're even capable of cultivating this earth for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Section 3 is interesting because section 3 talks about 2 things. And section 3 is about the necessary instruments or the foundations of Imaratul Ard. So once I have taken care of all the prerequisites, what are now the tools I need in order to build? Okay? The tools that I need to build, and those are 2 in particular. And that's what we're going to be discussing, inshallah, tonight. And I don't know if we're going to have a Tafseerah program next week. We're going to have to see, inshallah. But at least I will start this conversation tonight. We've covered all the prerequisites, all the necessary preconditions, right? But in section 3, it talks about the actual tools, the actual instruments that you're going to be using. These are basically your hand tools. These are your shovels. These are your pickaxes that you're going to be using in order to cause this earth to thrive and build it for the purposes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those tools are 2, and it's very, very important for us to memorize those. Al-fikru wal-mal. Al-fikru wal-mal. Thought and wealth. Alright? Thought is an interesting word because it includes intellect, it includes reason, it includes rationality, it includes ideas, it includes ideologies, right? And mal is the word in Arabic for wealth, right? Mal is the word in Arabic for wealth. Why do they call it mal? Mal in the Arabic language means something that bends over, right? Or swerves. And so some people said that المال لأنه يميل عن القلب يميل بالقلب عن الله, because it causes the heart to move away from God. Okay, the scholars also said that it is your responsibility as a believer to use wealth so that your heart swerves towards and not away from God. Right? يميل عن الله or يميل إلى الله. Right? يميل عن الله means to swerve away from God. يميل إلى الله, to swerve towards or in the direction of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, al-fikru wal-mal, thought and wealth. Those are the two instruments that build civilizations. Everything is derived from those. You want to talk about building big cities, it'll come from those. You want to talk about building a strong military, it'll come from those. You want to talk about inventions, it'll come from those, right? But I want to talk about thought a little bit tonight, inshallah, before I delve into, the meat of the surah. And by the way, section 3 starts pretty much with Ayatul Kursi. Okay? Section 3 starts with Ayatul Kursi, so that's, inshallah, I'm going to be touching upon that tonight, a little bit. So, fikr comes before mal, or mal comes before fikr. Which one comes first? Wealth comes before ideas, or ideas come before wealth? 100%, right? Without ideas, you have no wealth. And if you have wealth without ideas, your wealth is absolutely useless, right? Kind of like Dubai, right? There's a lot of wealth, completely and utterly useless, right? A lot of wealth in Saudi Arabia, utterly useless, right? But you have other countries with significantly less wealth, but great ideas, they might be actually able to lead the world. And I want to talk about, the concept of thought, just a little bit tonight. So, in ancient times, or pre-modern times, whatever you want to call it, empires used military conquest in order to basically acquire weaker populations for the purpose of exploiting them. Because the resources in the world were limited, everything was done through conquest. All right? And so when you think of the Greeks, for example, the Greeks had ideas. But those ideas were pretty much limited to Athens, and they were limited to a very short period of Greek history, maybe about like 25 years. That is the period of the rise of Greek philosophy and so on and so forth. Those ideas were so powerful that they continue to be relevant today in the world thousands of years later, right? But after Greece, which major empire came to existence? The Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had no ideas to sell in particular. Right? The Roman Empire was just conquer, take. That's all they cared about. Did the Mongols have any ideas? Absolutely not. It was just sheer conquest, nothing more to it than that. That's all they wanted. The barbarians, had any ideas to share? They didn't care, right? And so most of those prehistoric civilizations, the way they expanded and the way they acquired resources was through conquest, and through conquest they were able to oppress. They didn't think of it as oppression. It was just, how the world was. If I don't do it to them, they'll do it to me, kind of thing, right? And so in order to acquire resources, it was about expansion. It was about the acquisition of territory. It was basically about conquest, all right? There was no particular ideology or no particular set of ideas that, kind of permeated that process. But since the Renaissance, the European Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and so on and so forth, there is a set of ideas that were produced by European philosophers. So, I wouldn't be exaggerating if I said, since the time of Athens, since the time of the Greeks, until the late 1600s, where, the very first philosophers of the Renaissance, started writing and so forth, there was nothing except Islamic thought. I'm going to talk about that later, right? But in the context of European history, there was no production of ideas in between. All right? It was literally the ideas of antiquity and then the ideas of the Renaissance. And the ideas of the Renaissance, they revolved around very basic concepts: liberalism, individualism, capitalism, and materialism. All right? Should I say that again? Right? Liberalism, individualism, capitalism, and materialism. That is pretty much that was the foundation of all European thought, post Renaissance. And those ideas were pushed upon the world initially through colonialism, right? Immediately after those ideas were produced, the UK and France and other European countries, they started getting engaged in the process of colonialism, basically, the good old methods of the past. And through colonialism, and this was one of those very first times in history, of course, I think the only exception to that would be the Islamic civilization, but again, I'm not talking about that right now. One of rare times in history where conquest also leads to the transmission of ideas. Like I said, the Romans and the Mongols, they did not transmit any ideas. But it was the Europeans that started transmitting their ideas through conquest, through colonialism. But then they tried this for about 150 years, and they realized something. They discovered something. This was the absolute most powerful discovery of the 19th century, which is our ideas already took hold in the colonies. Why do we need soldiers on the ground anymore? If I can just leave the ideas and take the soldiers out, there will be no cost to this conquest. It will be the cheapest conquest ever made. Because my ideas will do the invasion on my behalf. I don't need to spend money. I don't need to train soldiers. I don't need to do, to kill people and get the public opinion, to hurt. I just need to leave those ideas in those colonies, that I have occupied for a number of years. And it's interesting because the colonized adopted those ideas as their own. Now, liberalism, individualism, materialism, whatever it is, capitalism, they have become the most popular ideas in the world. Why are they popular? Because they are good ideas? Not particularly. But because they were the ideas of the conqueror, they were the ideas of the victorious, and therefore they were adopted by the defeated. Okay? This is how things work. And so colonial powers left those colonies, militarily, but they never left them in an ideational sense. All their ideas remained. And now the colonized looks at those ideas as their own. They adopted the ideas of liberalism, materialism, and individualism as if those ideas are, of their own. But let me ask you, liberalism, individualism, materialism, capitalism, they all translate into what in the real world? One thing and nothing else. The most important thing on the face of this earth is what? Is money. The most important thing on this earth, the one thing that is worth living and dying for is, that's it. There is nothing else. There's no God. There's no hereafter. There's no moral considerations. There's no ethics. There's no principles. There's no values. There is no sacrifice. There is no soul. There's no afterlife. There is nothing to sacrifice for. The only thing that is worthwhile is money, 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 money. That's what I live for. That's what I die for. Okay? Individualism, liberalism, capitalism, and materialism, they translated themselves into one word, and that word is money. The constant, lustful, incessant, relentless acquisition of wealth. Not because I need that. By the way, this is the first time in history that we've developed this weird concept. People used to acquire wealth because of certain needs. Because they needed to buy a house, they needed to feed their kids, they needed to fortify their city, they needed the wealth for something. Only in the modern era that the acquisition of wealth became a goal in and of itself, completely independent of anything else. Why do you work so hard and you already make $150 million a year? Why are you still making more money? Because why not? Because that's just how it is. Today, how are individual success? How is individual success measured? How much wealth they have and how much money they make, right? You look at every company in the world today. What are the metrics used to gauge the success of those companies? How much money they make every year, that's it. Nothing else is considered. We don't look, or maybe sometimes we look at whether it was legal or illegal, there has to be some kind of rules, right? We don't look at the exploitation of individuals. We don't look at, the little kids in China that were crushed in those factories, at a penny per hour. We don't look at the impact on the environment. We don't look at the ethics. We don't look at the corruption, of the political process. None of that matters as long as that company makes money. That means that company is successful. How are government and government performance? How is government performance judged? GDP and GNP and per capita this and per capita that. That has become the yardstick by which everything, all success is measured in the modern world, right? That is the set of ideas that prevails in the world today. That is it. And that idea translates itself into what we see today. These, megalopolises, the massive cities, the high rises, the huge malls, the 10-lane highways, the inventions, social media, designer clothes, cell phones, glasses, shoes, fancy homes on top of the hill. That is all we look at. If you take a human being's life and you reduce it to its basic components, it'll all be material components. Where they work, how much money they make, their address, the car that they drive, their suit, their shoes, how much money in their pocket, their wallet, is from this brand or that brand, that's all it is. And then when that person dies, that person is reduced into a dollar figure that is distributed among, their heirs, and that is the story of human life. Now, I actually thought last week a lot about the conflict in Gaza, for example. And the conflict in Gaza is really interesting because this is the first time ever in human history where we have a genocide that is so fully documented. And it's documented by the actions of the perpetrators. It's the most mind-boggling thing. Like we've never seen any country that actually brags about genocide. We've never seen any army that brags about genocide. Like literally blatant violations of international law. According to international law, you're not, as an occupying power, you're not supposed to strip people naked and blindfold them and sit them in soccer fields. You're not supposed to demolish empty buildings. Like, we can go through the list of crimes against humanity, violations of international law that are committed one after the other, all fully documented by the very soldiers that are perpetrating it. And I kept asking myself, we're supposed to live in a democracy, and democracies, leaders make decisions based on what? Presumably, based on what? Perhaps not even the welfare. I don't think they care about the welfare. It's just, presumably, they care about the votes and they care about public opinion and how many people want right and how many people want left. At least, that's what we thought. Despite the international outcry, however, it seems that the elite around the world, and if you go to Europe, if you go to the United States, Australia, Canada, whatever, the populations are saying one thing, but their so-called democratically elected leaders are saying the exact opposite. That's one of the first times we actually see that. We realize that. We realize that democracy has essentially been this facade that covered those four principles of the Renaissance up to this day, right? Democracy was a cover. Democracy was a very effective cover because it gave people, sort of like that illusion of choice. But at the end of the day, the Western civilization is designed to achieve what? Is to achieve material wealth. That's it. And so, my theory is that the conflict in Palestine, and I know that sometimes we get a little bit simplistic, they hate Muslims. And this is like some kind of a Jewish-Muslim conflict. I actually, in my deep inside, I believe that it has nothing to do with that. I believe that the conflict in Palestine continues to be the way it is, and Palestine continues to bleed. And Western elites and politicians and media personnel continue to ignore the populations and continue to ignore the blatant crimes because there is a group of very wealthy and powerful people that actually benefit from the maintenance of the status quo in the Middle East as it is. They benefit financially from the implanting of the State of Israel in the midst of that region. And the leaders of the State of Israel know that they are so important. What they do is so important for those Western elites and very powerful people. In fact, I believe that there's a lot of Muslims in that group. There's a lot of people who call themselves Muslims that are in that group of the very powerful, the very wealthy, that will benefit financially from the continuation of the process. And it doesn't matter if it costs 35,000 people. It doesn't matter. Because they have so much to lose. When you think about it, you and I, we're simple people. I mean, if you invest in the stock market, what's the worst that you could lose? $5,000, $10,000, $100,000 if you're really like a millionaire. It's nothing. Those millionaires, like if there's millionaires, there's probably at least one millionaire sitting with us right now, right? It's nothing. Those people, they gamble with the billions of dollars. One bad business deal for them means what? Means utter destruction. It means like, 200,000 employees and their families, out on the street. It means billions of dollars lost. It is way too big for them. Way too dangerous for them to even budge. You see how, the UAE is. You see how the Saudi Arabia is. You see how the leadership in Egypt is. You see how, the world, all these leaders looking at what is happening right now, they're not even saying a word. Getting the word ceasefire from politicians is so difficult. And it doesn't do anything for them to say it, by the way. It is the pettiest request. But even that they cannot give. Why? Because there is a conflict here. A conflict between the interests of these relatively small but extremely wealthy and extremely powerful people, including Jewish, Muslim, Christian, atheist. They're all together bound by financial interests, and their populations, that they really don't care about them anymore, right? There is a limit to where democracy can take you as far as change, because that is the one thing you cannot change. You cannot change the very essence of the democratic system. You cannot change the very essence of Western civilization. You cannot change the very essence of the philosophical ideals that govern the world today. And those ideals are what? Liberalism, individualism, materialism, and capitalism. All designed for one purpose, and that is the amassing of wealth. You're okay with that? You get along with the system. If you want something else, you want values, you want principles, no. You're going to get marginalized, or we're not going to listen to you, and your vote does not matter, right? Why do I say that tonight? Because this ideational system, this philosophical system is entirely antithetical to the Islamic system, right? These two things cannot coexist. They cannot coexist. I know that they have been coexisting, but they haven't been coexisting. The Islamic ideational system has been crushed and suppressed. They're not coexisting. It's just one thrives at the expense of the other. That's really what it is. Okay? It's not a matter of conflict. It's just a matter of which ideas triumph in the end. The Islamic philosophical system is very different than that. The Islamic philosophical system acknowledges the existence of God. The Islamic philosophical system looks at the afterlife, looks at this dunya as a place of trial. For us, it's about family. It's about community. It's about moral action. It's about helping the poor. It's about universal brotherhood, right? It's about, communion with God. It's about submitting yourself to the will of the Creator. It's about being there for the poor. It's about standing up against injustice. It's about not indulging too much into the affairs of this dunya and not partaking too much in the affairs of the material. You see how those two things are very different? The Western measurement of success is about the dollar sign. Our measurement of success is way too complicated, right? There's so many factors that conglomerate into defining what a successful human being looks like or does, okay? How are you with God? How are you with family? How are you with your nafs? How are you with the community, right? How are you with the universal brotherhood of the ummah? Do you care about Gaza or not? Right? Are you able to ensure that your income is halal or not? What is your impact on the environment? That's environmentalism is not some liberal ideal. To the contrary, to the absolute contrary, right? The ideals of Western civilization, speak of the amassing of wealth at any expense, including the environment, right? It is only in the Islamic tradition that environmental factors must be taken into consideration. You cannot corrupt the water. You cannot cut down the trees. You cannot destroy buildings. You cannot, hurt people's, water supply and food supply and so on and so forth. There is rules for everything. Our definition of success is derived from our system of ideas. And our system of ideas is derived from that idea of fikr. What is the thought of Islam? And it has to be fikr, it has to be thought that is conducive to what? Going back to Surat al-Baqarah, to imaratul ard, to the cultivation of this earth for the purposes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not for the purposes of man, not for the purposes of, fattening your bank account, but rather for the purposes of the Creator. Because the Islamic philosophical system is God-centric. It is not man-centric. It's not dunya-centric. Dunya is just one stage of the journey, one bridge of the journey. It is not the end of all things, right? So you can see why, in order for the Western ideational system to survive, it has to completely suppress the Islamic system. And that's why the Islamic ideational system is such a threat. It's an existential threat to the Western system of ideas, because it is not based on the amassing of wealth, but rather based on the upholding of morals, based on otherworldly considerations. So if I go back to Surat al-Baqarah, and I say to myself, what is the theme of Surat al-Baqarah? The theme of Surat al-Baqarah is imaratul ard. What is it that human beings need to be taught in order to do the work of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on this earth? Section 3 of Surat al-Baqarah speaks about the two instruments of changing the world, right? Fikr, thought, and mal, wealth. Which also tells you that there is a preceding system of ideas that must become prevalent in the Muslim mind first, before you're able to actually use the instruments of change and the instruments of cultivation and thriving the earth for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And that is why this entire section, this next section that we are supposed to cover, basically addresses that. It addresses the system of ideas that will become an instrument to changing the world. One of the things that I always share incessantly, especially with the brothers and the sisters in my halaqah, is that this is something that Muhammad Asad said once in his book, This Law of Ours. There's a PDF copy of that book, by the way, available online if you'd like to read it. But Muhammad Asad says that Islam cannot change the world unless it becomes a culture-altering force. How can Islam become a culture-altering force? Right? By having a say about every cultural practice. Right? Islam needs to have a say about the movies. It needs to have a say about entertainment. It needs to have a say about the beauty industry. It needs to have a say about songs. It needs to have a say about construction. It needs to have a say about urban planning. It needs to have a say about the economics, about warfare, about the family relations, the marriage and divorce, inheritance. It needs to have a say, and that say has to be nuanced as well. So you can't just say, "Oh, this is haram. Here's the Islamic alternative." That's not the way. Okay, they're not going to listen to you. But the point is, you've been trying this particular method for so long, and it hasn't really been working, right? Well, why don't we try this other method that, without any imposition, it is inspired by Islamic teachings, but I actually think it is worthwhile. Maybe we should consider this. And sometimes I think that we need to be careful is that, before we go out into wider society and make our own commentary about social practices that are very pathological, that are very painful, okay? And say, hey, the solution is in Islam. Hallelujah. People don't react to that very effectively, okay? Sometimes you really need to take the solution, package it in a socially palatable sense, and implement it and live by it, and you don't need to even mention that this is derived from the Quran until way later in the process. If someone asks you, you didn't know that? I'm Muslim, man. Right? This is what I do. If you're a Muslim CEO and you run a company, for example, okay, you have to make a choice. Am I following the ideational system of Western civilization, or am I giving a chance to the Islamic philosophical ideals to reign? And you might say, well, am I going to be able to make maximum profit? Well, again, see, you're missing the point. That's not your objective. Your objective is not to make maximum profit, unless, of course, you adopt, the Western ideal. Your objective is to support your family, feed your kids, be in a relatively comfortable state, but also please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also, practice social justice, but also, have the least impact on the environment, be cognizant of the poor and the needy, practice, ethical practices in your own company, even if all that collectively means less profit, okay? In the Islamic understanding, you will be successful, right? Because you've secured all the important things, all right? And so Islam needs to be that, sort of like culture-altering force. And that cannot happen unless you take the philosophical system of Islam and you weigh it in against the philosophical systems of the Western world. And in a nuanced way, very effectively, keep dismantling that system one idea at a time, and you replace it with an Islamic ideal. By the way, I know that some of you might actually think that the evolution of those ideas is just natural, and it just so happened. Right? If you examine the ideas, for instance, of the Renaissance, you would assume that those are the philosophers of the time and their ideas became popular. Absolutely not. There was 150 philosophers, and only 3 or 4 of them, they picked those ideas and they popularized them. Okay? You look today, for example, look at Karl Marx, the Marx Engels reader. I don't know if any of you read, Marxism. All right? Almost all of Marx's ideas are now obsolete. Okay? Why did we adopt those ideas? By the way, the project of Marx and the project of liberalism, even though at face value they both look like they're different, but they are derived from the same, source of ideas, which is the Renaissance. Both of them are. And both of them pivot around the same thing. Materialism and individualism and all of that. It's just, they say things differently, but they come from the same source. What's his name? Sigmund Freud. All of his ideas are now obsolete. But the damage that he has done, psychoanalysis is now sidelined as an instrument of psychology and so forth. Okay? So, I don't want to say one person or a group of people, but again, the ideas produced by philosophers where there was a picking and choosing. If you actually read, for example, Darwin had a partner. SubhanAllah, I forget this guy's name. He was older than him. If anyone remembers his partner, what was his name? No, someone's on the phone. I just don't mind that. He had a partner, and both of them actually were working on that research together. If I get this guy's name, I will share it with you maybe next time. They were both working together as a team. You think that Darwin worked by himself. They worked together as a team. Okay. However, when it came to natural selection, Darwin had a very radical understanding of natural selection. Right? It was bloody. It was violent, survival of the fittest, and all this good stuff. His partner thought of natural selection as a very different process. There were, a lot of cooperation, a lot of selection, a lot of preference involved. Which of those 2 ideas would be preferred by colonial England? The nice partnership and kind, mild selection process, or the radical selection process that advocates the survival of the fittest? Of course, because it served their political agenda. They're going into Africa. They're going into the New World, right? And they want to take the land, they want to take the gold, they want to take all the territories. Which one fits their agenda better? That it's just the survival of the fittest, and it just so happened that the white man is the fittest. Sorry. It's inevitable. Right? That provided a philosophical backing to what otherwise is a heinous conquest, right? An oppressive conquest. The same ideas, again, you're going to be shocked. Fascism, Nazi ideology, same exact thing. What is the difference between fascism when Hitler and the Aryans say that the white race is more superior to the Jews and to everyone else? compared to the conduct of white Europeans in Africa and in the Americas? What is the difference? There's absolutely no difference. Because I'm telling you, at face value, liberalism, fascism, communism, they all look like they're very different, but they're derived from the same philosophical pool, right? It's a pool of ideas, and those ideas are just shuffled and reshuffled in a way that just gives off the illusion of diversity, when in reality it's just the same system, all right? Individualism, liberalism, materialism, and what was a lot of isms, I think. I'm losing track of the isms, all right? So, again, the Islamic system is not like this. The Islamic system is not opposed to urban development. It's not opposed to high rises. It's not opposed to inventions. It's not opposed to military efficiency. It's not opposed to wider highways. It is just opposed it's opposed to the wrong purposes of all of this. If you're doing all of this for the sake of amassing wealth, then you are not following the Islamic, ideal. If you need a high rise in order to house thousands and thousands of people, and you're going to be mindful of their rights, you're going to be mindful of the space, you're going to be mindful of the environment and all of that, then it would be okay. Right? And so this upcoming section talks about, the Islamic ideals, the thought, fikr, right? That is an instrument of changing the world. You have to change the mind first before you change anything else. You cannot cause people to be khulafa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without them understanding who they are and what role they play. All right? So there's 5 different ayat here in this section that we need to cover. First is Ayatul Kursi. And Ayatul Kursi is extremely important because Ayatul Kursi establishes the idea of thinking of God and establishing God rationally by examining His names and His attributes and His impact and presence, in the world. All right? The ayah that comes right after, La ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion, okay? Which establishes the freedom of choice. See, this is our type of freedom. You choose God or you don't choose God, that is up to you. That is not something that can be imposed on people. That is not an ideology that can be shoved down someone's throat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted you that right and that freedom. It is divinely granted. Right? So if Ayatul Kursi establishes God rationally, La ikraha fi din gives people the right to reject that rationality if they choose so. Ayah number 3, the conversation that happened between Ibrahim and Nimrod, the king of the Babylonians. Right? And what does that ayah establish? Again, the rational process of defending the existence of God. Right? See? Our system of ideas. Story number 4 is the story of Al-Uzair alayhi salam. And that is a story about accepting ilmul ghayb, accepting the knowledge of the unseen, or the knowledge of the things that reside beyond the perception of man. And number 5, the story of Ibrahim and his conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala about the birds. Remember? And that conversation, inshallah, we're going to get into each one individually. It establishes the necessity of asking questions to clarify. You put all of that together, it'll give you basically the general characteristics of the Islamic philosophical system. So we have to go into these, obviously one by one, and delve a little bit deeper, inshallah. First is Ayatul Kursi. Okay, and I want to cover that just a little bit tonight. I can't cover all of it, but inshallah I will do some of Ayatul Kursi. There is an ijma', there is a consensus amongst the scholars of this ummah that Ayatul Kursi is the greatest ayah in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's the greatest and most important ayah in the Quran. Okay? In fact, the hadith here in Sahih Muslim, it is the hadith of Ubay ibn Ka'b radiallahu anhu. And Ubay ibn Ka'b, his nickname was Abu al-Munzir. So the Prophet ﷺ asks Ubay ibn Ka'b and he says, Ya Aba al-Munzir, atadri ayya ayatin min kitabillahi a'zam? Do you know which ayah of the book of Allah is the greatest? subhanallah, just there's a thought that occurred to me when I was telling this story. If when my dad, alayhi rahmatullah, when he was in the illness basically where he passed away, and he went through heart problems for a long time, but he had this huge library of books, and basically he divided up the library between my brother and myself. My sister was not very interested in books at the time, so she got nothing. She got other things, but the books, the boys got the books, right? And so I got half, and he got half. But my dad said something really interesting before he passed away. There was a particular book in the library, and he said, of all the books in this library, this is the most precious. I know you're going to ask me which book it is. I'm not going to tell you. All right. So this is a family secret. We won't share that one. All right. So he said, I want you to take good care of this library, but particularly this book. This is the most precious book. We didn't know. He never told us before that he had a particularly favorite book in the library, right? So now you can imagine, after we distributed all the books, there was a fight, over this particular book, between my brother and I. Not the fights that people fight over inheritance and stuff like that. It wasn't that bad, right? I had to bribe him a little bit. I had to, sweeten the deals. I got it. Alhamdulillah. Now I'm not gonna tell you what that book is, and honestly, when I look at that book and I compare it with the other books in my dad's library, it doesn't. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't feel to me that it is more valuable than the other ones. Somehow this book impacted him spiritually a certain way, and it just became his favorite book. And because that book became his favorite, it automatically became important to me. He says, take my library of 500 books, one of them is really, really important. I value my dad's library so much. I have every single book, alhamdulillah, still intact to this day, right? But that particular book occupies a special place in my heart because my dad mentioned it by name. He said, and inshallah ta'ala, this automatically became like an heirloom item in our family. So when I leave the world, I'm going to make sure that, one of my boys, inshallah, will take this book and we kind of keep it in the family like a ring or an old watch or something like this. It derived value because it was mentioned. All the Quran is important and beautiful, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, this book that I'm giving you, there's one ayah that matters more than anything. There is one ayah that is the greatest in this entire book, and that is Ayatul Kursi, right? Ya Aba al-Mundhir, he says to Ka'b, أتدري أي آية من كتاب الله معك أعظم? Do you know which ayah in the book of Allah is the greatest? So he says, as the Sahaba, they always had this courtesy. So he said, Allahu wa Rasuluhu a'lam. They always refrained, had hayat, from responding to these questions. They always assumed that the Prophet's questions are rhetorical, and they would not give an answer. Allahu wa Rasuluhu a'lam. Allah and His Messenger know best, right? So he asked him again, Ya Aba al-Mundhir, أتدري أي آية من كتاب الله أعظم? So he asked him again, and when he asked again, that's when the Sahabi knew that this is not a rhetorical question. The Prophet ﷺ is actually demanding an answer, right? Do you know which ayah in the book of Allah is the greatest? That's when Abu al-Mundhir, Ubay ibn Ka'b radiallahu anhu answered, and he says, قُلْتُ اللَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا هُوَ الْحَيُّ الْقَيُّومُ. And he recited the very part of the ayah. قال فضرب على صدري. The Prophet ﷺ, placed his hand on my chest like this, which was an endearing thing that Rasulullah did, out of love and affection. And he said to Ubay radiallahu anhu, Wallahi liyahnika al-ilmu Aba al-Mundhir. When in Arabic, when someone, something good happens to you, say, Hani yalak, right? Hani and lak, right? May all the blessings be to you. What an incredible feat you've achieved. So the Prophet ﷺ says, Wallahi liyahnika al-ilmu Aba al-Mundhir. May Allah bless you for your knowledge, for your wisdom, O Abu al-Mundhir, because he figured it out on his own. Okay? And so this is the greatest ayah in the Quran. Okay? And the scholars say it's the greatest ayah لِمَا اشْتَمَلَتْ عَلَيْهِ مِنَ الْأَسْمَاءِ الْحُسْنَى. It has, I think, 5 of Allah's great names in that ayah, many of His qualities and attributes, but it also negates deficiencies from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well, as I will share with you. If you were to write a lecture, if you were to write a speech of praise, for example, right, about someone like a leader or your parent or someone, I want you to just imagine, all the beautiful things that you would say about that person. Now imagine that, your parent said, I want you to praise me using these words. Because I know that you look at me a certain way, but these are the things that matter the most, and I want you to use these words if you were to praise me. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you want to praise me? Do you love me? Okay, here's how you show it. I'm going to write it down and make it as simple as possible for you. Now, there's a lot of weak ahadith that talk about Ayatul Kursi, and I wanted to also mention that so that we never talk about it again. There is this weak hadith that says Ayatul Kursi Sayyidatul Quran. It's the matriarch of the Quran. Right? This is a very, very weak hadith. In fact, some of the scholars say that it is fabricated. All right. Another hadith that says it has 50 words, and in every word it has 50 blessings. Again, that hadith is also fabricated. Another hadith that says, Surat Baqarah is the foremost surah in the Quran, and Ayatul Kursi is the foremost surah in Surat Baqarah. Again, that also is a very, very weak hadith. All right. Also, the hadith that says that Ayatul Kursi is 1/3 of the Quran or 1/4 of the Quran, that also is a very, very weak hadith. Okay. Now, Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah, radiallahu anhu, who is he, by the way? Who is his father? Ali ibn Abi Talib, radiallahu anhu. Imam Ali had many, many, many sons, right? But he had, 3 very notable sons. Obviously, Al-Hasan al-Hussein, right? The great scholars, this is the most favorite to the Prophet ﷺ. But he also had Muhammad, was his son from the woman from Bani Hanifa, not from Fatima. Okay? And Muhammad became very, very great, knowledgeable scholar. He was one of the foremost scholars of his time. And Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah says, لما نزلت آية الكرسي خر كل صنم في الدنيا. When Ayatul Kursi was revealed, every idol on the face of the earth fell flat on its face. Okay. Now we don't know if he meant that as in a literal sense, or if he meant that this ayah establishes the tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which basically, made it almost like every idol fell flat on its face. We're not sure. خر كل صنم في الدنيا وخر كل ملك في الدنيا, and every king, every absolute monarch on the face of the earth also fell off their throne. وسقطت عن رؤوسهم التيجان, and the crown fell off their heads. وهربت الشياطين يضرب بعضهم على بعض, and all the shayateen, they ran away scrambling, basically cutting off each other and bumping into each other. حتى أتوا إبليس, until they came to their chief, Iblis himself. Right? فأخبروه بذلك فأمرهم أن يبحثوا. They told him, oh my God, something happened to us. We all went crazy like headless chicken and we started bumping into each other. What happened? So he said, okay, let's investigate this together. حتى أتى المدينة فبلغهم أن آية الكرسي قد نزلت. Until they arrived in Medina, they realized that Ayatul Kursi was actually revealed. Again, was Muhammad being literal about this, or he's saying this in a metaphorical sense? Again, is very interesting to investigate. All right. Abdurrahman ibn Auf, radiallahu anhu, one of the Ashara, one of the 10 al-Mubashirin bil-Jannah, إذا دخل بيته قرأ آية الكرسي في زواياه الأربع. Every time he entered his house, he would go into every corner of the 4 corners of his house, and he would recite Ayatul Kursi in order to seek protection, upon his house. Imam Ali, radiallahu anhu, ibn Abi Talib, said in the authentic narration, سمعت نبيكم صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو على أعواد المنبر يقول, I heard your beloved Prophet when he's standing on his pulpit say, من قرأ آية الكرسي دبر كل صلاة لم يمنعه من دخول الجنة إلا الموت. This is, by the way, how we derive the very popular practice of reciting Ayatul Kursi after every prayer, right? We recite Ayatul Kursi after every prayer, right? So Ali ibn Abi Talib says, I heard the Messenger ﷺ say on the pulpit, in the khutbah, if you recite Ayatul Kursi after every prayer, the only thing that stands between you and Jannah is death. Which means if you die now, inshallah you have your place reserved in Jannah. In the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, also عن أبي بن كعب رضي الله عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال والذي نفسي بيده. The Prophet ﷺ talks about Ayatul Kursi and he says, I swear by He in whose hands are the affairs of my soul. والذي نفسي بيده إن لها لسانا وشفتين تقدس الملك عند ساق العرش. That Ayatul Kursi has a mouth and has lips, meaning it speaks. And it is holding tight to the arsh, to the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it constantly praises Allah Azza wa Jalla. Also Abu Umama al-Bahili radiallahu anhu, this is when you know when the hadith is authentic, because if the Prophet ﷺ gave the hadith in the khutbah, that means there was so many people in attendance. So you have so many narrations and the hadith becomes almost mutawatir, which means that it has more than 10 separate chains of narration. So this is a hadith of Abu Umama al-Bahili radiallahu anhu, another attendee who heard the Prophet ﷺ say, whoever recites Ayatul Kursi after every prayer, the only obstacle between you and Jannah is death. What is Al-Kursi, by the way? And what is the difference between Kursi and Arsh? What is the Kursi? I know. That's the word that we use today for chair. Sure, right? What's the word for Urdu, by the way? It is Kursi, right? And in Farsi? Oh, so it's not Kursi. You guys need to fix that. That's not right. What's the word in Pashto for chair?
Okay.
Same?
Sorry.
Huh? The pronunciation is different? It's interesting because today, in modern Arabic, the word for chair, and obviously Urdu as well, the word for chair is kursi. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also established on the throne, like a great king, right? What is the word for throne that is used in the Quran? Arsh, right? Arsh. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is established on the throne, but then what is the kursi? No, there's something very specific. If you guys have the modern sofa sets, okay, there's usually like a big sofa, like the three-seater sofa, and then there is the two-seater sofa, also known as. You guys know your stuff, huh? All right, and then there's the one-seater, okay, and then there's that little piece that most people don't know what to do, and they just put it in the corner. They put it in the garage, right? What do we call it? See, again, we call it Ottoman because the Europeans, because they're super scared of the Ottomans, and they wanted to humiliate the Ottomans. So when you put you extend your legs and put both of your feet on that particular cushiony piece, they used to call it Ottoman as an insulting statement, or derogatory statement about the Ottoman Empire. Same with croissants, by the way. Who loves croissants here? Yeah, we all do. Don't be scared. Raise your hands. I'm not going to judge you, right? The croissant was actually baked by the Austrians in order to celebrate the defeat of the Ottoman army. So they baked it so that it looks like a crescent. Looks like some people are like, oh my God, it looks like a crescent, and they call it croissant. What is croissant? Crescent. What is wrong with you guys? Right? I'm more tired than you. I'm supposed to be like running out of energy. I gave 3 khutbahs today, okay? So in a derogatory fashion, Europeans used to call that extra cushiony thing, they used to call it ottoman, okay? I actually, like, it doesn't exist in Arab culture, so I don't know what it is, but that is al-kursi. It's basically, in a metaphorical sense, where the king rests his feet. So the king is established on the arsh, the throne, and he rests his feet on this kursi. Okay? The word kursi, surprisingly, is mentioned in the Quran only once in this ayah, and is mentioned in the Sunnah only once. Never mentioned after that one time. In the hadith in Bukhari, the Prophet ﷺ says, and this hadith is absolutely incredibly philosophical, by the way. You know, the Prophet ﷺ says, مَا الدُّنْيَا فِي السَّمَاءِ الْأُولَى إِلَّا كَحَبَّةٍ فِي فَلَى. All of this dunya, compared to the first layer of heavens, السَّمَاءُ الْأُولَى, the first sama, right, is, the analogy is that of a sand particle compared to a huge desert. وَمَا السَّمَاءُ الثَّانِيَةُ وَمَا السَّمَاءُ الْأُولَى فِي الثَّانِيَةِ إِلَّا كَحَبَّةٍ فِي فَلَى. And the size of the first heaven compared to the second is the comparison between, you know, one sand particle and a desert. All right. وَمَا السَّمَاءُ السَّابِعَةُ فِي الْكُرْسِيِّ إِلَّا كَحَبَّةٍ فِي فَلَى. And if you compare the 7th heaven to the kursi, it's like comparing a sand particle with the desert. وَمَا الْكُرْسِيُّ فِي الْعَرْشِ إِلَّا كَحَبَّةٍ فِي فَلَى. And if you compare the kursi with the arsh, it's like comparing a sand particle with a desert. What does that tell you? What is the Prophet ﷺ trying to tell us about the universe? It's a very, very, very enormous place. It's a very enormous place. That is the very first instant in ancient times where someone uttered a statement that implied that the universe is that big. Is that perpetually, exponentially big, right? And that was the very first time, you know, and there's other ahadith, by the way, that indicated the same thing. So this is the first time we hear the word kursi in the Sunnah. All right? Now, there are other ahadith. One of them talks about how Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu used to recite Ayatul Kursi before he goes to bed, and the Prophet ﷺ upheld that, and that also became Sunnah. And there is, you know, another hadith of one of the companions that kind of felt that he was being brought into the presence of jinn. He felt that there's some kind of presence. And so he says, أَإِنْسِيٌّ أَنْتَ أَمْ جِنِّي? Are you from the ins or are you from the jinn? So he said, I am from the jinn. Of course, we don't know. Maybe the hadith, it was all in his head. We don't know if this was just an illusion. Okay? But he came to the Prophet ﷺ saying, Ya Rasulullah, I think I've seen jinn in my house, as community members often tell me. Okay? And I don't laugh at them when they say that. Okay? I tell them exactly what the Prophet ﷺ said. Okay? If you feel scared and there's a presence of something else, what do you need to do? You recite Ayatul Kursi. All right? Because it can provide that, that protection. And this is in the collection of Imam al-Nasa'i. And again, all of the other weak or fabricated narrations, I warned you against those. So let's not indulge in those. Now, what is it exactly that Ayatul Kursi say that, inshallah, is going to be the subject of our conversation next time? I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase us in knowledge and humility. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among the true people of the Quran. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept us in the highest level of Jannah. Allahumma ameen. Jazakallah khair. Inshallah, we're going to take some questions and we'll pray Isha and send you guys back to continue to help with the Palestine exhibition project. So if you have any questions, please fire away. Yes.
What's the name of that book you mentioned? Not the book in your dad's library, the one Muhammad Asad.
This law of ours. This law of ours. Yep.
So, did you mention that kursi is just used once in the Quran, and that's with Ayatul Kursi? Because there's another surah.
Did I say that it was only mentioned once in the Quran? I did not investigate that. Maybe it was mentioned more than once in the Quran, but in the Sunnah it was mentioned only once.
So the reference of the kursi that's mentioned is in Surah Sad, which is referencing
Sulaiman alayhi salam.
Exactly.
Yes.
So what is
correct?
What is the it seems like there's a correlation. It sounds to me that it's Kursi is basically the kingdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that encompasses everything from samawat to earth.
If you want to take it metaphorically, if you want to take it metaphorically, then sure. I mean, that has caused all kinds of ruckus in Islamic history. Does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have a hand? Does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have ears to hear? Does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala smile? And if he smiles, does that mean he has a mouth? Do we take this literally? Do we take this metaphorically? Welcome to the club. They've been arguing about this for 1200 years, including the arsh, the throne. Is it a real throne? Is it a metaphorical throne? Is kursi just a reference to God's power and might and kingdom and sway? Or is it something literal? There's all kinds of views about that. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
One of the things that historians have talked about, like looking at American history, but maybe Western history in general from post-Renaissance, is that you had the separation between church and state and society and church growing further and further apart, where now you're at a point where most of society is devoid of the spiritual core and ethics, right? And even if you look at the numbers now, majority of people now will say that they are not of any organized religion anymore in Western countries. Actually, I was just reading the other day that majority of Europe, except for maybe I think one small Eastern European country, does not believe in an afterlife any longer.
Right.
So we've come to that point, and so when the thoughts of the Renaissance were first proposed, they were proposed with the idea of promoting human flourishing, but they didn't want to unbetter it from, I don't know if I said that right, but take it away from the idea of God. And it's only now in the modern manifestation of it that God has been removed from those ideas. And so then the question becomes, Imam, are those ideas worth salvaging, and can they be salvaged with the reintroduction of a spiritual core? And my argument and my hope is that Islam could be hopefully providing some of that.
I guess to attempt to radically erase a set of ideas and replace them with others, I think that is always, it requires a tremendous amount of cruelty to achieve that. It's going to require carnage, massacres to achieve something like that. So Islam never did this. If you actually followed, the Islamic conquests, how Islam penetrated into North Africa, the Levant, Turkey, Africa, Persia, and so forth, Islam just worked with local systems and adjusted and tweaked and caused those ideas to evolve. So no, I'm not an advocate of the complete eradication of any system of ideas. What I wanted to say is that Western ideals, as they are being practiced today, I guess I see your point. Were they always meant to be like this, or did they kind of devolve over time? That is, we can debate that. We can discuss that. But if you actually see, like, C.S. Lewis, there's a lot of C.S. Lewis, for example, he says that the secular system of Europe, all it did is that it derived religious ideas, removed God from them, and still made them sacred in a secular sense. Every secular idea is still consecrated but it's consecrated without God. It's still made into something that you're supposed to believe in. I mean, think about, the Declaration of Independence, for example. Think of the Bill of Rights. These are documents that are written by men. Men that were slave owners, men that had concubines, men that were not of the greatest moral character, yet we trusted them to basically write this document, and it became almost like a religion. Like today, the average American, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, it's like they talk about it the way we talk about the Quran. You talk about it the way that the Christians talk about the Bible, right? So the idea of freedom, the idea of individualism, where do these ideas come from? They're not self-evident, particularly. On what basis, at least if I have religion, I'll be able to make reference to God or make reference to the scriptures. But if you don't have religion in the picture, on what basis are you saying that, all human beings are created equal? Who came up with that idea, right? It is not particularly self-evident. It is certainly was not particularly self-evident in the case of Thomas Jefferson himself, right? He was not equal with the men that he controlled their lives. And so, at one point or the other, all we did is that we derived ideas from religion, from the sacred. We trimmed the feathers, we cleaned it up, removed God from it, but we continued to make those ideas sacred. Why do we have a jury system in the United States today? Have you ever asked yourself that question? The jury system is the absolute worst legal system on this planet. You get these people who are completely uninterested. How many of you actually sat on a grand jury before? How many of you received an invitation to be in a jury? Thank you very much. I rest my case. We run away from this thing like it's the plague. We don't want to do it. Who ends up, you think, who ends up sitting on a jury? Those who couldn't get out. They have no interest whatsoever in this. They want this thing to be done, and just let's go home. All right? Who says that putting 20 people with no legal knowledge whatsoever to sit there and kind of be manipulated by the sound bites of attorney and prosecution is a good idea of justice? Who gets to? Yet the vast majority of Americans take the idea of jury as if it's just the most sacred thing. Nobody ever thinks about changing that. Okay? It has become consecrated. Right? And I think the reason this happens, in my personal opinion, is that man always yearns for the sacred. We always yearn and aspire for something that is established as true and self-evident beyond the definitions of human beings. That used to be God. Today it's the Constitution or whatever else that we come up with. But our hearts always yearn for the stability of something that is self-evident. So I'm not sure if that answers your question particularly. Any other questions? Yes.
It's not a question, but just like throughout the point that you said that the concept of what's happening in Gaza right now is not really about Muslims versus Jews, but financial success. If you look at Raytheon, which sells weapons and stuff like that, their stocks before October 7th, right, those went down, then automatically they went up, right? And how a lot of these politicians work is that they have these stocks, right, within Raytheon, and so they're interested in picturing this force that their stocks, right, their income increases. And also there's other companies, and if you look at it in a bigger sense, there's bigger companies that invest in Raytheon, right? That these politicians also invest. And so all around, all their money is invested in making war. And so you understand?
100%. War is very good for business. Think of the rebuilding of Gaza. Well, sooner or later, they're not. This is premium real estate. This is beautiful Mediterranean, resort town. Regardless of, I hope inshallah ta'ala the Palestinians are not going to go anywhere. Over 2 million Palestinians. Hopefully, they don't end up in the Sinai, right? But regardless, if they manage somehow to displace them, Gaza has to be rebuilt. How's that going to happen? Construction, cement, lumber. Engineers, companies, architects, you name it, hundreds of billions of dollars are going to be flowing, and people are going to be making truckloads of money. The UAE, I don't know if you guys heard, the UAE has actually created this land passage or bridge, whatever you want to call it, from Dubai all the way to Tel Aviv in order to provide the Israelis with much needed supplies and stuff like that. I know it's heinous. I know that you're disgusted when you hear something like this. But in the minds of those who did it, it's just business. It's an opportunity to make money. That's it. The Emiratis don't particularly like the Israelis, by the way. And the Israelis are not in love with the Emiratis. It's just business relationships. And Muslims are so naive. When Putin comes in support, a little bit, not too much, in support of Gaza, we kind of yeah, Russia, right. Dude, take it easy. You have to understand what's going on here. These are very powerful people with extremely massive interests. Every word matters, and every gesture matters, and everything that they do or say or not do and not say matters so much. At that level, one tiny little mistake means billions of dollars. Right, and so they have to be very careful. Walking this, walking this landmine, with great caution. Am I saying that's just how the world is and let's leave it be? No. You can still upend that status quo. We've seen, things turn around, and we've seen very powerful people come to the ground. And we've seen the weak, become powerful. Right? So our job as Muslims, and as the Khulafa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is to continue to push forward and to continue to still strive to do the right thing, regardless of the cost.
So,
yes.
I want to just add to
of course.
Point. Actually, the war in Ukraine is a huge manifestation of what we were saying. We're spending hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that the constituent not necessarily wanted to continue.
Subhanallah. The war in Ukraine, by the way, would be a great example of the same exact thing. Yeah. And it's interesting because you would think that, okay, you have Russia, you have the US, they're fighting this proxy war in the Ukraine. Both of them as countries, they have enough resources to finish the war very quickly. Why has the war been lingering for this long? Because keeping the war is good for business. On both sides. I know that you might not, wait a second, are you suggesting that Russia and the US have somehow agreed in a closed room to keep the war going? Well, I'm not sure. Maybe. That's not particularly what I'm saying, right? But again, at the very end of the day, when push comes to shove and they're making their calculations, they realize that keeping this going is actually important. Why is the war in Gaza important for Netanyahu? Because his political future hangs in the balance, right? If the war is over, they're going to turn against him. He's going to be the very first scapegoat. He's going to be the very first victim. So you know what? Let's just keep it going, as long as possible. Without knowing that, you're not going to be able to approach the matter realistically and come up with realistic solutions. Yes?
So do you think the representative of Palestinian people, which is Hamas, they do not realize that they're actually facilitating by resisting, so they're costing the people's lives by forcing a resistance. How do you see it all ending then?
I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know how it's going to end. This is God's universe. He will decide. I'm a human being. I only know what I see, and the amount of information I have is very, very limited. I have no idea what I'm going to have for dinner tomorrow. Let alone think of how this conflict is going to be resolved. I do have to say, however, that Hamas did not start the conflict. Hamas, number one, Hamas is not a representative of the Palestinian people. We have to establish it. Hamas is a faction of the Palestinian people. They believe in resistance. Not all the Palestinian people believe in that same path. Some of them believe in diplomacy. Some of them believe in political maneuvering, whatever it is. Most of that, I think, has proven to be a complete failure. It did not work. All right. So now a lot more Palestinians, they're resorting to Hamas because They've tried the peaceful methods, and the peaceful methods have worked. Might as well, resort to resistance. Are we going to die? Yeah, we're going to die, but we're going to die with dignity. We're going to die with honor. What's the point of living as cowards? What's the point of living under oppression? What's the point of just eating and drinking? You live in one big, prison. So you might as well fight, and if you win, you win, and if you lose, then you die as a shaheed. I think that's what many of those people have been thinking now. And here's the thing, again, if you think using Western philosophical ideals, then it would look like what is happening in Gaza is absolute destruction. But if you look at it through the lens of Islam, then, okay, 35,000 people died, but inshallah ta'ala they're going to be shuhada, right? We're not hoping that more people are going to die, obviously, but we're just looking back at the victims. They are with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as shuhada. The entire ummah has been awakened. The Western world now realizes that, democracy is just a big lie. Everyone understands now that the media is not telling them the truth. I think there's an awakening among Muslims, all around the world. There's massive pressure, on different governments. There is, for the very first time, there's mainstream criticism of the state of Israel right here in this country. People call Israel a terrorist state. All of that was impossible a year ago, right? So if you look at the situation of this entirety, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will decide. But it is not. We cannot use the material lens here as the only lens to judge this situation, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Jazakumullah khair. Okay, two last questions. Yes.
Which one?
No, you just see that. North Africa and then Nigeria. Yes.
عنك اليهود والنصارى حتى تتبع ملتهم. Basically, they will not agree with us and do each other right. And so within the form of ideas and throughout history, when Muslim had the upper hand, we took the Jews and the Christian and the rest, and we treated them well. When they had the upper hand, obviously, you have the Inquisition, you have all the killings and all the atrocities that come. At the end of it, Islam is under attack. And the Ummah is weak. And all these manifestations of India and Kashmir and everywhere else, the manifestation of these ideas coming together and hitting us, and then they want them to be weak. They want to weaken our control. And as you said, until we wake up, and waken means, basically waking up within our own community, finding our way, being strong, because this world only understands strong. Without strength, we are not.
Right.
We are suffer without us. And I agree with you that awakening that the Palestinians have showed us, and the result they have, I think it's for all the population to one day. Hopefully, in the near future, that we will see the awakening where we are still alive here.
I mean, the only modification I would make, I think, to your statement is that I don't think that the West hates Islam in the sense that, they don't like the teachings of Islam, or they don't like our prayers, or they don't like our modesty. I think that what is dangerous about Islam is its ability to change society. What is dangerous about Islam is its cultural force. And that is what they're scared of. They are perfectly okay with you if you practice Islam, like the Sufis practice Islam. Right? You go to the mosque and you do your thing, and the whirling dervish, and just have fun and go home. But the minute Islam becomes, has a say, about what happens in society and how people conduct themselves and how government does business and stuff like that, that is when Islam becomes dangerous. I wanted to direct you, by the way, to a couple of books I find to be extremely important for us to read. One of them is Wa'il al-Hallaq's most recent book, The Impossible State. Halak, Hallaq, by the way. He's a Palestinian Christian scholar of Islam. Was in Toronto, I think, and then he was hired by Columbia, a few years ago. An absolutely incredible scholar, by the way. I personally believe, and a lot of people believe, that he's Muslim. He's a closet Muslim. He just doesn't want to lose his academic credibility. But his most recent book, The Impossible State, is going to be very, very telling. And a lot of the things that I shared with you, Wa'al Halaq, kind of briefly mentioned in the book. Also, the other book that I think is going to be really useful if you want to have these conversations further, we talked about Muhammad Asad earlier, right? His son Talal, by the way, is a professor. I think he's at NYU. He's a professor of anthropology. His name is Talal Asad, A-S-A-D. And his incredible masterpiece is called Formations of the Secular. You can find all these books available online. Formations of the Secular. It shows you, demonstrates how Western secularism is essentially a religion. It just took a different name. And how religious practices are actually often very pragmatic. So he kind of really takes you on this journey to question a lot of your convictions about both sacred and secular ideas. So you're going to find those books to be very helpful, inshallah.
My thought when you mentioned the vehicle by which the colonialists changed the world and moved their ideas, and also change the thought of their colonies, even going back to their countries, and still able to, like France, all the Francophone countries, they're still able to manage the economy, choose their president to
this day.
I just want to see how your thought is on how education is part of that vehicle. Because, for instance, in Nigeria, when the colonialists came to the western part of Nigeria, they stopped the Muslims from going to school. Unless you change your name. Pretty much you cannot be a Muslim by name going to a school.
Straight up.
Yes. And a lot of, that's why in the western part of Nigeria, you find out that there's a lot of Christians, and it was a lot of Muslims at that point. Not as strong as the northern part, but the Muslims. But with that, with the children going to school, the curriculum was 100% Christian. And in the process, by the time they left school, a lot of them became lukewarm Muslims. A lot of them lost their identity, and a lot of them, they all became Christians. So, what is your thought about education? It looks like with the stagnation of Islamic thoughts at some point in our history, and the transfer of knowledge to the West, part of that vehicle is the education system.
Right.
Whereby we are Muslims by name, but in our thought process, in our thinking, we are just like them, we are materialists.
Absolutely. And by the way, this is a very important point, and that the reason it's extremely important is because one of the longest lasting legacies of the colonial era is the educational system. It's really, really ironic because we keep saying the reason Muslim countries are behind is because, we're behind in education. But when you think about it, when you try to engage in the educational system, you're still adopting the system that the colonial powers left behind. One of the greatest and most ironic manifestations of this, by the way, is the requirement that religious leaders and imams have university degrees. Right? I'm not opposed to universities. I have so many degrees, right? But especially in the earlier years of my career, I would ask that question a lot. What are your qualifications? Which Islamic university did you graduate from? And, again, I'm not opposed to, those who go to Al-Azhar or go to, the Darul Uloom Deoband or any of the formal schools. But when you think about it, those are Western university style education systems. In the Islamic world, education was never conducted that way. It was never conducted in this centralized schooling system where everything is streamlined, where the government that controls the curriculum and there is a constant dissemination of information. This is how you control the population, right? This is Bismarck in Prussia, who basically wanted to create a system to create soldiers, to produce soldiers. Soldiers that are, I don't want to even say brainwashed, but soldiers with some kind of a unified mission to serve the Prussian state and so on and so forth. That's the very origin of the modern school, right? And so in our attempt, as opposed to the Islamic system, which was very decentralized, it was very masjid-oriented. It was a combination of sacred and secular sciences, right? So the sheikh in the masjid, who, by the way, did not graduate from any of the universities, Imam Malik and Hassan al-Basri don't have PhDs, right? We don't say, Dr. Hassan al-Basri, right? This is a Western word. This is the Western designation, right? And so the education was done mostly at the masjid. It was the student teacher ratio was extremely favorable because usually like one sheikh with 7-8 kids, 7-8 students, they study together. They do aqidah and philosophy and hadith and Quran and so on and so forth. But they also do chemistry and history and humanities and physics and biology and all kinds of other subjects, right? It was extremely comprehensive. And the teacher was a mentor. He was a murabbi in the strict sense of the word. Pays attention to every kid, their stage of development, their parents, their circumstances, their weaknesses, their strengths, right? And tailors the educational experience to become a best fit for this particular individual at that stage of their development. Now, when Finland does that, everyone looks at Finland, it's the most amazing system in the world. And Muslims have done this, for 1,000 years. And only recently that this ancient but very effective system of education was replaced by Western-style educational systems, where you have to go to school from a very young age. They rip the kids out of their parents' hands at the age of 5. And some foolish parents, they want to make it even earlier. My son is 4, but he's so smart. Will you take my son? So literally the parent wants to take the 4-year-old kid, hand them over to a complete stranger for 9-10 hours a day, and then complain why the kids are just crazy and they've developed all these weird ideas. As opposed to the kids staying with the parents until the age of 7, 8, or 9, and then hand it over to the sheikh that teaches them, through the mentorship process. And so again, that is the Western educational system. So we have to be careful. When we say education, what do we mean by education? Do we mean going back to the traditional Islamic system? Then I would say absolutely. When I say let's send more kids to the schools that were built by the occupier, I say that's maybe not a good idea. Does that make sense? And of course, the Western powers will use that. All these Christian kids they talk about. In West Africa, by the way, it was the same. When I went to Sierra Leone and Guinea, it was the same exact thing. Sierra Leone, 95% Muslim. Okay, but who are the political leaders in the history of the country until today? There's only one Muslim president ever elected. All Christians. All the ministers, all the owners of the big companies, most of them are Christian. Why? Because they graduated from those Western-style schools, right? And they think of themselves as white. That's the funny part. They're Christian, they think they're white. They call their kids white names. James and Johnson and John and stuff like that. You see in Liberia, you see in Nigeria, they adopt fully Western names as well, right? And so colonial powers have definitely exploited this. But in my opinion, the solution is not to send Muslim kids to those same schools, but rather to send them to traditional schools that are comprehensive enough to teach the children all kinds of subjects, but in this nuanced fashion that we talk about. We probably have to stop here, guys. Inshallah to pray Isha. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل وسلم في خير الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات تواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاكم الله خير. إن شاء الله operation 3 minutes. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.